For decades, Rob Reiner was seen as an icon of talent, power, and integrity in Hollywood. But recently, candid revelations from Ron Howard have opened up a different perspective, not to slander or stir controversy, but to shed light on the truths behind the glamour that the public rarely hears. Ron Howard's revelations have prompted many to reconsider relationships, choices, and the price of fame in the entertainment industry. If you want to understand why this story is considered changing everything we've ever known, watch the video to the end. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more insightful, neutral, and in-depth analyses of Hollywood in future videos. There was a period when everything for him became chaotic. Delusions, panic attacks stemming from substance abuse, a series of legal troubles, and at times he was on the verge of losing everything, even risking having nowhere to go. He entered rehabilitation programs many times, but each time it ended prematurely. Instead of getting better, things seemed to spiral downwards, slowly but irreversibly. For many years, Ron Howard appeared to the public as a rare Hollywood legend untouched by scandal. Always calm, always smiling, always the image of a golden boy who matured into a master director with a nearly perfect career. But behind that image lay a silent storm. Unspoken thoughts, buried memories, truths Ron kept hidden, while the world only saw stability and success. Now, after the heartbreaking news of Rob Reiner's passing shocked the entertainment world, Ron has begun to open up. And what he's sharing is making many people look at Hollywood in a different light. He speaks of a very real Hollywood, where competition isn't loud, where emotions are often hidden, and where respect between talented people isn't always openly displayed. What happened around Rob Reiner seems to have touched something deep within Ron. It made him reflect on the fragility of everything, on how things can change in an instant, and that even the brightest stars can get caught in complex, hard-to-define relationships. Remarkably, this feeling is deeply personal. Ron's years of silence have finally broken, and every word he speaks carries weight. He alluded to memories and emotions directly linked to Rob Reiner, leading many to realize that their connection was far deeper than the public had previously known. The story of Ron Howard, born in Duncan, Oklahoma, unexpectedly unfolds with more layers than ever before. Before fame became a familiar concept, he grew up in a family where art was the daily breath. His father, Rance Howard, and his mother, Jean Spiegel, raised him in a creative environment, but one where discipline was never compromised. It was a world of imagination alongside harshness, of long working hours and the constant instability of Hollywood. That environment shaped Ron, and it also bound him in unexpected ways to Rob Reiner. What Ron is now revealing may change how the public perceives both of them. From a very young age, Ron Howard lived under the spotlight of film sets. When he was just over a year old, he appeared in a feature film completely unaware that he had just embarked on a lifelong journey with the camera. That first role was not just a memory, but the beginning of a career that would last for decades, a path Ron almost never left, even in moments when he might have wanted to turn his back on it all. In the late 1950s, the Howard family settled down and moved to California, where television was booming. From that moment on, the concept of a normal childhood almost ceased to exist for Ron. The dining table at home gradually became a place for studying lines and reading scripts, while his father, Rance Howard, was busy juggling military service and rushing between auditions. Ron, then a young boy still teething, memorized his lines with the seriousness of a grown actor. Instead of roaming the streets with friends, his world was confined to the enclosed studios, where studio lights replaced natural sunlight. Years later, when asked if he had ever considered writing a memoir, Ron said he had never seen it as necessary. But then a piece of advice changed his mind. If he were to tell his story, he should start with his childhood. Looking back, Ron calls that period a golden cage. It was security, fame, the privilege many people dream of, but also a quiet solitude. He had everything success brings, except for the simple, everyday moments most children experience: carefree play, innocent mistakes, and the feeling of being himself. The big turning point came when a family television series premiered, and Ron, then only 6 years old, suddenly became a household name. Overnight, he became an icon of innocence and purity, the image of a child beloved by all of America. But behind the on-screen smile was a boy quietly doing his homework in the small rooms behind the studio, listening to the natural laughter and chatter from a world he didn't belong to. Ron's father tried to protect his son as much as he could. He fought to ensure his son had suitable roles, reminding him to always maintain humility, and especially not to act cute, but to be authentic. This teaching became the foundation for Ron's entire artistic journey. However, despite being surrounded by love and proper guidance, the emptiness of growing up in front of the camera could not be erased. Being a child loved by millions, yet without the opportunity to explore himself like other children, was an invisible price to pay. During the same period, Rob Reiner was also growing up in that same harsh environment. Another young soul learning to face fame, to be celebrated but also constrained. Both understood that unique feeling, widely admired but silently isolated. Those pressures didn't disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. They settled, accumulated over the years, and gradually became a part of Ron Howard's being. Looking back decades later, Ron admits that the scars from his childhood never truly healed. They followed him into adulthood, influencing how he viewed fame, family, and the tragedies faced by people like Rob Reiner. As Ron entered his teenage years, the public saw a string of successes. But behind that was a young man burdened with far heavier emotional weight than his age would suggest. When the show that became synonymous with Ron's name ended, he was still very young, but had spent almost his entire childhood in a pre-written world, perfect but not entirely real. Ron grew up surrounded by kind and dedicated adults on set, but missed the necessary chaos of youth, the mistakes, the rebellion, and the freedom that truly mature a person. His education was fragmented between traditional classroom learning and hurried backstage tutoring sessions, with a tutor sitting nearby while cameras and lighting equipment blared just steps away. Ron's lunches weren't noisy conversations with his peers in the school cafeteria, but quiet meals with the actors and crew. These were warm, caring moments, but also constant reminders that he was living in a different reality. A reality where success came early, but childhood slipped away quietly, leaving lasting echoes throughout his life. Yet even in seemingly peaceful moments, Ron soon understood that the road ahead was not smooth. At times, he told himself he had to keep going, and everything would eventually pass. He didn't let those worries consume him daily, but they were always present, silent, and persistent. One unforgettable memory came from the time Ron participated in the musical The Music Man. He was only 8 years old then, facing a dance scene he couldn't perform perfectly. In a moment of panic, Ron turned to Shirley Jones and whispered that he couldn't do it. She gently reassured him, helping him regain his composure. And the film crew cleverly concealed his clumsy moves with clever camera angles. The audience only saw a confident, lovable, and charming boy. But inside, fear and pressure were intertwined. It was experiences like these that led Ron, as an adult, to deeply empathize with Rob Reiner. Both grew up in the spotlight of fame. Both had fathers guiding them. And both quickly realized that behind every perfect shot was a child trying to keep from falling apart. Those hidden anxieties never truly left Ron. They just learned to hide behind a calm exterior. Over the years, Ron became adept at projecting confidence even when he was down inside. It became his survival armor in Hollywood, helping him navigate the chaos, the big egos, and the never-ending expectations. While people like Rob Reiner were known for their bluntness and boldness, Ron chose to observe quietly, maintaining a safe distance, listening and analyzing everything with his characteristic focus. Then a new chapter opened when he joined Happy Days. At 19, Ron walked into Gary Marshall's office, unaware that he was about to take on a role that would once again conquer American hearts. As Richie Cunningham, he became the ideal boy next door, polite, loyal, and pure. However, while the public adored Richie, Ron felt cornered. Once again, the image everyone revered began to imprison him, obscuring his true self behind that familiar smile. At 23, he was still playing a teenager, while the world outside was changing rapidly. Protests were making headlines, society was shifting, and his generation was beginning to question old norms. Richie Cunningham, meanwhile, seemed frozen in a cocoon of nostalgia, detached from reality. This disconnect grew increasingly severe until Ron decided to speak out. He wrote a memo to the station, simply asking for a storyline that touched on the real issues of the time. A story that reflected the world the audience lived in. But that request was quickly denied. The rejection didn't cause an immediate outburst. It subsided, smoldered, and gradually turned into profound weariness. Ron began to feel invisible behind the character, as if he were living someone else's life, while his own real life stood still. The further he went, the clearer one thing became. If he wanted to rediscover his voice, if he wanted to grow and create authentically, he couldn't continue standing in front of the camera. The only way to escape that familiar mold was to step behind, where he could tell stories in his own way, no longer bound by the image others expected of him. And that very moment of realization, the one that spurred him to leave the spotlight and step behind the camera, was also a kind of awakening that Rob Reiner later experienced. Both followed the same path, searching for personal truth within a system that constantly tried to confine them to fixed roles. For Ron Howard, directing wasn't simply a career ambition, it was an escape, the only way he could truly breathe. After years of being dictated how to act, what to say, and who to be, being behind the camera felt like escaping an invisible cage. His long journey in pursuit of fame gave Ron a profound understanding of the value of finding his authentic voice, an experience he deeply shares with people like Rob Reiner. They both found themselves through directing, even though their filmmaking styles and public images were almost entirely different. The freedom Ron had long awaited finally arrived in 1977, when Roger Corman made him a life-changing offer: star in Eat My Dust, and in return, Ron would direct his own film. It wasn't a chase for a blockbuster or a pursuit of fame. It was the first time in his life he had complete control over his own career. That film later became Grand Theft Auto, a chaotic action comedy revolving around insane car chases, co-written by Ron and his father, Rance Howard. The budget was a mere $62,000, almost unimaginable by Hollywood standards. Yet, through daring and creativity, Ron executed a series of audacious stunts, destroying nearly 70 cars, and turning a small gamble into a box office success of $15 million. For the first time, he clearly felt creative control, something acting had never given him. The feeling was exhilarating, addictive, and powerful. But in Hollywood, control always comes with a harsh price. Each film became incredibly personal. Every detail carried weight. Ron was obsessed with his work, memorizing every comment, every frame, every reaction. Success followed success. Films kept coming. Night Shift, then Splash, followed by Cocoon, Willow, and Parenthood. Each project elevated his reputation and expanded his budget. But with it came ever-increasing expectations. Studios placed their complete faith in Ron, hoping he would create miracles again and again. And that faith gradually turned into a silent but persistent pressure that followed him everywhere. By the early 1990s, Ron Howard was no longer the boy from Mayberry. He had become a force to be reckoned with, a name that carried weight in Hollywood. And like Rob Reiner, he stepped into a spotlight that was both dazzling and potentially scorching if one wasn't careful. Ron's obsession with control and perfection didn't simply stem from ego. It was a need to prove something to himself. This very motivation allowed him to deeply understand what talented directors like Rob Reiner faced behind the camera. Sleepless nights, the pressure to create masterpieces time and time again, and the silent, unspoken exhaustion. Then a pivotal year arrived, a year that nearly broke Ron, but also shaped him. Apollo 13 was more than just a film. For Ron Howard, it was a personal mission. He was determined to pursue absolute precision and authenticity. Gradually, he found true joy and creativity through research, through the pursuit of truth, and then used his full understanding of drama and humor to tell that story in a way that was both captivating and profound. No shortcuts, no artificial drama, only the naked truth. Ron valued authenticity so much that the film crew shot hundreds of zero-gravity shots on a special NASA aircraft, where each moment of zero gravity lasted only a few dozen seconds. He also rejected illustrative props. The Mission Control Center was built from scratch, using actual NASA control panels, each panel costing only a symbolic price, but carrying with it history and absolute precision. It wasn't just a film. It was a statement about how Ron Howard viewed cinema, truth, and creative control. Every light, every switch, every blink of an eye had to be of absolute precision. There was no room for compromise, no acceptance of anything less than perfect. Ron pushed himself to the absolute limit, working almost continuously for months, long, drawn-out days, nights with only a few hours of sleep. He refused to simplify even the most complex scientific details on screen, because for him, the truth could never be diminished. But perfection, however sublime, has its breaking point. One morning, his body could no longer endure it. Ron collapsed on set from exhaustion and severe dehydration. The entire film crew had to stop so he could recover. When Ron returned, his face pale but his eyes still resolute, he was greeted with shirts emblazoned with the words, "Mission Control." It wasn't a joke, but a silent message. "We're here. We'll see this through with you." Ron smiled. The calm and humble smile the public was all too familiar with. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had gone too far. The fine line between passion and self-destruction had blurred, and he only realized it when his body forced him to stop. In that painful moment of awakening, Ron understood what Rob Reiner had also experienced. Sometimes the price of excellence is the risk of losing oneself in the pursuit of it. Ron Howard became such a perfectionist that he unknowingly pushed himself beyond his limits. That haunting truth followed him for years. Not only because of the health consequences, but also because of what it silently took from those he loved most. The lessons learned from that period, about control, about truth, and about authenticity, changed how Ron viewed Hollywood, the allure of creative power, and the brutal price it demanded from those who craved greatness. So when the sad news of Rob Reiner reached him, the emotion went beyond mere loss. It was regret, profound reflection, a belated realization of what relentless dedication can silently take away. Both men lived on the same creative fire, both pursued perfection to the very end, and both learned that passion, if unbalanced, can lead to loneliness. But even before Rob Reiner's passing, Ron was facing his own pain, a quiet but persistent wound. It was a period where, on the surface, everything seemed perfect. The family welcomed a new member, the career flourished, creative freedom reached its peak. Ron became the director every studio wanted to work with, a name, almost a guarantee of success. Then a major project arose, pulling him away from his family for months. Ron believed he could manage, that the sacrifice was only temporary. At home, his wife always supported him, taking care of the children who were still too young. Meanwhile, Ron, on the other side of the world, was caught in a whirlwind of endless script revisions, harsh working conditions, complex scenes, and immense pressure from the studio. He told himself it was all worth it, that success would eventually compensate for everything. But deep down, a growing unease gnawed at him, as if he were drifting further and further away from what truly mattered. And then when Ron returned home, silence spoke for all. No reproaches, no arguments, only an emptiness where laughter once existed now seemed distant. That was the moment he understood that not all losses come from failure. Some losses occur even when one seems to be winning. That bond had fractured without him realizing it. Ron realized too late that success had come at a price he never wanted, never prepared to pay. That regret, the irretrievable lost years, the silent emotional distance that formed within his family, all became a burden he carried for years afterward. Perhaps that's why Rob Reiner's story resonated so deeply with him, because in a way, it reflected the very pain Ron was all too familiar with, though he rarely spoke of it. The moment Ron walked through the door after a long series of filming days almost brought him to his knees. His youngest daughter, Jocelyn, looked at him with a strange expression, not recognizing the man standing before her. Bryce, his older daughter, reacted indifferently, as if he were just a passing guest. Cheryl, his steadfast and quiet partner, was present in a state of profound weariness that needed no reproach. Everything was silent, but that silence spoke volumes more than any argument. Years later, Ron dared admit that memory had left a deep wound within him. It was the day he confronted a harsh truth. All awards, all accolades, all brilliant achievements were meaningless if the price was the loss of those he loved most. In that very moment, he made a silent promise to himself. He would never let it happen again. He would never let his career take more than it gave. He believed in that promise, believing he had learned the necessary lesson. But life rarely operates according to simple promises. Years later, during the stressful return to another major project, Ron felt the old cycle returning. Sleepless nights, constant worry, the pressure to make the right decisions, and the obsession with perfection once again consumed him. He left home for extended periods, telling himself it was all temporary. Then, upon his return, he realized his children had grown, not just physically, but emotionally and in their own lives. Cheryl kept the family afloat with her quiet strength. She didn't complain, she didn't resent, but Ron knew she was carrying more than she should. Later, he confessed that this second misstep forced him to confront something deeply ingrained in him since childhood, the belief that he had to say yes to every opportunity, to strive relentlessly, to prove himself worthy of staying in that cutthroat industry. The pursuit of perfection had propelled him to the top, but it had also brought with it a lingering guilt that never faded. It wasn't until many years later, in a private and symbolic moment, that Ron truly let go of his defenses. Standing where he and his wife had first met, he said what he had never dared to say publicly before, that if he could, he would trade all his awards, all his successful films, all his accolades to relive the time he had lost with his children. Those words silenced the space, for they were so genuine that they needed no embellishment. And that explains why Rob Reiner's story impacted Ron so deeply. Because when Rob's journey ended in his mind, it wasn't just a feeling of loss for a colleague or a creative icon. It was a reminder of all that Ron had sacrificed, lost, and ultimately learned. Both men lived their dreams to the fullest under the dazzling spotlight. And they both understood that the true price of that dream was never cheap, nor was it ever simple. Rob Reiner lived his life with powerful energy, passion, honesty, and unwavering loyalty to both his art and his beliefs. But there are battles that no one, no matter how powerful or successful, can completely control. And for Ron Howard, witnessing Reiner's journey only made him reflect more deeply on the people who quietly shaped him long before fame, awards, or the spotlight entered his life. Because before all those achievements, before his marriage, before the endless glamour, there was a relationship that became the foundation of the Ron Howard we know today. It was the quiet but enduring bond with his younger brother, Clint Howard. In the public eye, Clint is an unforgettable face, a unique, quirky actor, appearing in everything from science fiction to big-budget films. But for Ron, Clint was more than just a brother. Clint was the only one who truly understood what it felt like to grow up in a world where cameras never left them. The two brothers grew up side by side on adjacent film sets, passing each other in the cable-filled corridors under the heavy rumbling lights overhead. They were children earning money before they knew who they were, learning their lines before they could even name their own emotions. In an industry that demanded perfection over patience, Clint's presence was a silent reminder to Ron that he wasn't alone, that there was someone else who shared the same extraordinary yet exhausting childhood memories. They weren't just brothers. They were colleagues, confidants, survivors of a Hollywood childhood that outsiders could hardly imagine. But as they grew older, new challenges arose, challenges neither of them were prepared to face. While Ron steadily rose to become a leading director, trusted by studios and given major projects, Clint quietly struggled with his own battles. Pressure, the harsh pace of life, relentless scrutiny, all gradually wore Clint down in a way Ron couldn't stop. By the late 1980s, things had spiraled out of control. Ron could only watch in fear as his brother drifted further and further away from the life they had built together. This helplessness became an obsession because for the first time in his life, Ron understood that love alone wasn't enough without boundaries. In 1990, in a painful but necessary moment, Ron was forced to make the hardest choice of his life. He issued an ultimatum, not out of anger, but from a love so deep it frightened him. Either Clint sought help, or Ron could no longer stand by and watch his brother spiral into self-destruction. Those words hurt both of them, but they also changed everything. Clint resisted, but ultimately he chose recovery instead of sinking deeper. That decision not only saved Clint's life, but also strengthened the bond between the two brothers in a more mature and lasting way. For Ron Howard, it was the clearest proof that love isn't about holding on tight, but about letting go at the right time, giving the one you love a chance to live on in a better way. In 2021, the Howard brothers finally revealed their full story in their emotional memoir, The Boys, a candid, sometimes painful confession of the harsh honesty and unconditional family love that pulled Clint back from the brink of collapse. The book doesn't aim to romanticize the past, but rather to record what saved them: truth, boundaries, and unwavering family ties. But decades after all that, a new, quieter, and more terrifying fear has emerged in Ron's life. A fear that cannot be solved by discipline, controlled by planning, or avoided by work. Clint is facing a serious health battle, an illness Ron briefly describes as life-changing. Details are kept secret, but Ron's lowered voice, heavy demeanor, and somber gaze speak volumes more than any explanation. This wasn't a fleeting setback. It was the kind of event that would turn life upside down, transforming long days into a series of hospital visits and long nights into endless, silent anxiety. For someone who had spent their life controlling the narrative, making decisions, unraveling problems, and rewriting the ending, this was a devastating wake-up call. Ron couldn't yell, "Cut." He couldn't reshoot the scene. He couldn't protect his brother the way Clint had silently protected him when the cameras grew too heavy and fame too lonely. For the first time in decades, Ron admitted something the world rarely saw in him: fear. Not fear of failure, not fear of losing his position, not fear of pressure or criticism, but fear of losing the person who had always been there for him throughout his life. That fragile sincerity, that raw and helpless emotion, changed Ron in subtle yet profound ways, to the point that even those closest to him noticed. It was that pain that shaped how he received the news about Rob Reiner. As Clint's health deteriorated, Ron was forced to confront a truth he had avoided for too long. No matter how many awards, how perfect the cinematography, how meticulously crafted the ending, there are stories beyond one's control. The man who had spent half a century leading Hollywood with composure and precision, telling stories that touched millions of hearts, was now facing something he couldn't direct, couldn't edit, and couldn't plan to escape. In recent conversations, Ron admitted that the experience surrounding Clint's health had shaken him more than any other setback in his career. Not the intense pressures of large projects, not the doubts, not even the most grueling professional challenges. Nothing could compare to the paralyzing fear of facing the possibility of losing a brother. He recounted sleepless nights, where memories replayed like an old film. The small study room on the set, the whispered conversations while waiting to film, and how Clint's presence once warmed the cold spaces under the fluorescent lights. Those memories, once a source of comfort, now became a painful reminder of all that could be lost. Ron also shared the moment he witnessed Clint still bursting with creative energy, passionately immersed in music, meticulously refining every detail, conversing with the sound engineer with his familiar focus. That moment was both beautiful and heartbreaking. After all, Ron admitted to a deep sense of guilt, not for having done anything wrong, but for realizing too late that there are moments that cannot be postponed, relationships that cannot be put aside after work, and stories that matter more than any film ever made. That guilt haunted Ron because while his career soared to unimaginable heights, Clint quietly struggled with his own difficulties behind the scenes. Guilt for not recognizing the warning signs sooner. Guilt for not being able to protect his younger brother, the way Clint had silently shielded him from the loneliness of growing up in front of the camera. That heavy regret completely changed how Ron viewed his current life. This new chapter in his life was built on a fragile blend of love, fear, and experience. It forced Ron to slow down, literally. He began withdrawing from long, physically demanding production projects, outright refusing jobs that required months away from home. Even Imagine Entertainment, the powerful studio he co-founded in 1985, now operated more independently, giving him something he had thought impossible for years: time. No more endless filming schedules, no more 18-hour workdays. Ron Howard's life now revolves around what always mattered most, but was once relegated to the side of work: family, his younger brother, and the fragile value of simply being present. It is this authentic and vulnerable version of Ron that deepens his reflections on Rob Reiner's legacy. One legend quietly commemorates another, both forged by love, by loss, and by the price of caring too deeply about people and art. These days, Ron Howard's world operates on a different rhythm: slower, gentler, and focused on what truly matters: Cozy dinners, quiet conversations, small but irreplaceable moments, all the things he once let slip away, now become the main beat of his life. Ron made it clear that he didn't want to lose them again. In one of the most moving confessions of his career, Ron admitted that the quiet periods between projects opened up a perspective he couldn't have. For the first time, he allowed himself to speak the truth. For decades, he had spent his life telling other people's stories, but neglected his own. Now, at 71, with a vast legacy and a lifetime of success behind him, he finally realized that all awards and box office success become meaningless if the people he loves gradually drift away from his life. Fans were stunned not because Ron had faced hardship, but because he had carried so much pain in silence. The man, always seen as calm, steady, and kind, had fought silent battles for years without showing a crack. And when he finally spoke, the pain became undeniable. It turned out that some wounds never truly heal, even for one of Hollywood's most beloved figures. But just as Ron was beginning to find peace in this slow, steady chapter of his life, the world around him was shaken once again. Another kind of loss, sudden, shocking, and profoundly painful, ripped through the film industry and pulled him back into the unavoidable fragility of life. The devastating news about Rob Reiner came as a cold shock, leaving Hollywood stunned. At the time, Ron Howard was already emotionally fragile, silently grappling with growing anxiety for his brother Clint. A jumble of conflicting emotions, fear, guilt, and remorse, had not yet subsided when a brief news item brought everything to a standstill. The world fell eerily silent. The news spread quickly, dryly, and cruelly. Rob Reiner, at age 78, was pronounced dead, along with his lifelong partner, Michelle Singer. The shock swept through the film industry, leaving friends, colleagues, and fans speechless. For Ron, it wasn't just a morning news item. It was a blow to the heart. After all the losses he had suffered, the disappearance of a person who had profoundly influenced his life and career caught Ron completely off guard. The man known for his composure suddenly felt the familiar foundation beneath his feet tremble. That moment was almost indescribable. Ron Howard, an icon of restraint and emotional control, was utterly overwhelmed. The suddenness, the surreal feeling, and the weight of the bad news left him speechless. Ron had always held Rob Reiner in high regard, not only for his filmmaking talent, but also for his strong personality. Rob was explosive, sharp, and unafraid to confront. Ron was calm, persistent, and precise. Two contrasting styles, yet they met at a core: a fervent belief in the power of storytelling and creative honesty. Both were storytellers forged early in the harsh environment of Hollywood. Growing up in front of the camera, burdened by expectations from a young age, they understood the price of success. They struggled with creative control, faced unwanted compromises, and kept their individual voices from being lost in the commercial whirlwind. They were like two different halves of a journey, one vibrant and outspoken, the other quiet and persistent, but both driven by the same desire to tell the most authentic stories possible. Therefore, as the somber news continued to spread, the shock intensified. The disjointed, incomprehensible, and haunting details plunged the entertainment industry into an unusual silence. The tragic discovery of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer, found by their daughter Rory, deepened the pain. This was not a peaceful or tranquil passing, but an event that forced a confrontation with the fragility of life. And for Ron Howard, it was a bitter reminder that even legends cannot escape the cruel losses of fate. An ending no one could accept, especially Ron, who was already exhausted by the mental burden of his brother Clint's deteriorating health. This tragedy was not just a shock, but a blow to the most fragile part of him, where worry, helplessness, and the fear of loss had been simmering for so long. Those close to Ron during that period recounted that he was pulled back into old memories, years of watching others struggle with their own darkness. Those were harsh times, where the line between hope and despair blurred. Facing such a devastating loss left Ron not only grieving the death of a friend and colleague, but also haunted by the brutality and meaninglessness of everything that had happened. A close friend quietly shared that Ron kept asking himself, unable to find an answer. Why Rob? Why Michelle? Throughout his life, Ron Howard believed that stories could bring order to chaos, that cinema could help people better understand and cope with the world. But in that moment, that belief seemed to crumble. He was forced to confront a form of darkness that no script could ever adequately address. There was no satisfying ending, no sufficient explanation. Only emptiness remained. This tragedy shook Ron to his core, shattering the fragile sense of security he had painstakingly built over the years. The grief for Rob Reiner spread far and wide. Social media and the press were flooded with tributes, love, and shock. This showed how Rob had touched the hearts of so many, not only through his iconic films, but also through his candid voice, courage, and unwavering belief in the pursuit of truth. But for Ron, that wave carried a deeper, more personal meaning. In those words of gratitude, he saw his own struggle with loss, painfully reflected. Ron had always admired Rob's boldness, his willingness to speak his mind, even when it was controversial. Ron himself had chosen a quieter path, letting stories speak for themselves instead of personal opinions. But in this moment of shared grief, all differences became meaningless. There was no more style, no more stance, no more creative ego. Only pure pain and the fragility of human existence bound them all together. Those close to Ron said he was haunted by the thought of Rob and Michelle's final moments. Already burdened by the constant worry about Clint and the irretrievable passage of time, this event deepened a wound that had yet to heal. Ron recalled Rob's final public speech, where he spoke of love, family, and what remains after a lifetime, with a rare calmness and understanding. The irony made it all the more heartbreaking. Rob had contemplated the finiteness of life with a venerable serenity, unaware that his journey would end in a way that would shock the world. In a rare public statement, delivered quietly and without the ostentatious air of Hollywood, Ron spoke of his grief in simple yet powerful words. He spoke of Rob not just as an actor, a director, or a social activist, but as the real person behind all those roles, a man who lived for love, for truth, and for family. For Ron, that was the essence of Rob Reiner. He expressed deep respect for how Rob used his voice and influence to question the world, to force others to think, even when it was controversial or controversial. Ron acknowledged that some losses are so senseless that they force one to question everything. They make us pause, make us realize the value of being with loved ones while we still can. When speaking of Rob and Michelle, Ron's voice softened. He emphasized that they were passionate individuals, deeply connected to each other, and always believed that life should be lived meaningfully. For him, it was an indelible legacy, and their tragic deaths were a shared wound for everyone who knew them. Ron also couldn't hide his sorrow when mentioning Rob and Michelle's children, especially Rory, who had to face a pain no one else deserved. His words weren't loud or overly sentimental, but they conveyed the profound loss that an entire community was bearing together. It wasn't just grief for two people, but a pain for the values and bonds that had once been so clearly present. In a moment of reflection, Ron spoke about their shared journey, people who had grown up in the same harsh industry, many from a very young age. They had witnessed each other's lives, both in the spotlight and in the hidden corners the public never saw. It was this quiet bond that made this loss even harder to accept. Ron acknowledged that such events force people to pause, to confront the fragility and unpredictability of life, where everything can change in an instant. For Ron, who had been living with constant worry about his brother Clint's health, the shock of Rob and Michelle's deaths was a painful echo of all the losses he had experienced. It reminded him that no matter how hard one tries to control life, one is never the ultimate decision-maker. But this tragedy brought more than just pain. It also clarified something Ron had only recently come to truly understand: the importance of slowing down, cherishing the present moment, and keeping family at the center of life. Realizing he had spent decades telling other people's stories while quietly neglecting himself, Ron felt those reflections now carried a completely different weight. The heartbreaking end of Rob Reiner, a man who lived boldly, loved wholeheartedly, and created relentlessly, was more than just the death of an individual. It was a profound reminder of the value of presence, of love, and of daring to live authentically in a turbulent world. For Ron Howard, all of this simultaneously served as a mirror, a wake-up call, and an unavoidable lesson. It reminded him, and everyone listening, that no matter how dazzling the Hollywood lights may be, true legacy rarely lies on screen. It exists in everyday moments, in the time we spend together, in the people we love, and in feelings we should never take for granted. Following Rob Reiner's tragic death, a quiet tension began to build. Not from resentment or blame, but from unspoken feelings between two men who had shared a life in the same world. The relationship between Ron and Rob was always multifaceted, difficult for outsiders to fully understand. Beneath the public admiration and professional respect, another element existed: competition. Silent, complex, sometimes sharp enough to leave invisible wounds. Both followed parallel paths in Hollywood, each building their own creative universe. They were both children of the film industry, both understanding the price of success and greatness. Yet, their worldviews were almost opposite. Rob Reiner was always outspoken, forceful, and unafraid to disrupt the established order to create change. Ron Howard chose a different path: calm, cautious, believing in the power of subtlety rather than direct confrontation. This difference, though masked by respect, sometimes created a gap that was difficult to define. In the film industry, there were whispers about their silent competition for the same projects. Scripts were passed between studios, producers caught between Reiner's explosive enthusiasm and Howard's steady, precise style. There was no open conflict, no scandal, but the tension was real. They were like two planets in the same orbit, drawn to each other by respect, but also pushed apart by the egos and pride of those at the top. After Rob's death, that feeling of incompleteness became even more haunting. Those close to Ron said he constantly recalled old conversations, times he could have picked up the phone but didn't. Memories of meetings at events, polite smiles, a friendliness that was always kept just right. All now appeared as unfilled gaps. A longtime friend once said they both admired and challenged each other, perhaps more than either of them were willing to admit. And with Rob gone, Ron had to face that burden, the regret of a friendship that was never fully concluded, and the lingering feeling of a rivalry that never had a chance to be resolved. In a rare interview when asked about Rob, Ron fell silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and slow. He said they hadn't always seen eye to eye, but Rob had made him a better professional. And perhaps that was something he never got a chance to say. That brief statement carried everything that needed no further explanation. Two men, two styles, two legacies, bound together by respect, rivalry, and things left unsaid while time still allowed. As the days of mourning dragged on, the images of Rob Reiner and Ron Howard reflected each other more and more clearly. Hollywood remained in its grief, and Ron had to learn to live with questions that would never have complete answers. But behind the candlelight vigils and solemn tributes delivered on the award stage, another undercurrent is quietly emerging. It's not scandal or accusation, but the slow unveiling of unspoken secrets between two men who shaped an entire generation of Hollywood cinema. As time recedes, industry insiders begin to look back at the past with a different perspective. Details once considered insignificant now carry new weight. Short conversations, polite nods, fleeting encounters are now placed within a deeper context. Between Rob and Ron, there was always an unspoken understanding, not hostility, but a subtle tension, like an electric current running through the room as two perfectionists recognize familiar pieces of themselves in each other. Rob often entered the room with a fierce determination and a belief that everything could be challenged. Ron, however, was different. He approached things cautiously, selectively, with little concern for status or rank, and always kept a certain distance from the ostentatious pursuit of fame. It was this difference that both attracted and pushed them apart. Rob's assertiveness often inadvertently pushed Ron to take greater creative risks. Conversely, Ron's patience and meticulousness forced Rob to pause, reflect, and look deeper into his own choices. They weren't rivals. They were like mirrors reflecting aspects of each other, revealing parts they both recognized and avoided. In their rare recent conversations, Ron began to speak more frankly about their relationship. He asserted that it was never a race for revenue or fame, but a much larger question, a question of meaning and legacy. Ron once admitted that perhaps they had unintentionally created distance, not out of malice, but because of the prolonged silence. That confession sent shockwaves through the industry, revealing that behind the red carpet smiles lay a layer of unspoken emotions. There were stories of meetings that ended in creative disagreements, presentations where both were captivated by a single script, and calls that never went through after a misinterpreted comment. Back then, they were all too small to bother with. Now, they've become heavy memories. Those close to him say Ron rewatched films he once admired, not to compare them, but to better understand the differences in Rob's storytelling. And when asked what he would say if they had one last conversation, Ron responded with rare honesty. He said perhaps they were both wrong to think it was competition. In reality, they were trying to say the same thing, just in two different languages. Those words resonated with many because they peeled back the glamour to reveal the shared pain of artists constantly grappling with a fragile and unpredictable world. As time passed, the story faded from the pages of newspapers, but for Ron Howard, it remained present in every quiet moment. What the world calls a closing, for him, felt like an unhealed wound. Not just because of the loss, but because of all the unspoken words between two people who once walked side by side in the dazzling lights of Hollywood. In those silent moments, Ron replayed the memory of their last meeting, a casual conversation at a charity event when neither knew it would be their last. The space around them was still noisy, laughter and chatter mingling with the flashing camera lights, but a strange silence hung between Ron and Rob. Rob leaned in, flashing his familiar smile, and half-jokingly remarked that they were both control freaks, only more easily swayed than they actually were. Ron laughed reflexively, but deep down he understood Rob had hit upon something very true. That was the essence of Rob Reiner, straightforward, sharp, and unafraid of the truth. Ron remembered that moment, and now that Rob was gone, that statement echoed in his mind, an unshakable reminder. Those close to Ron noticed he was quietly changing. He wasn't throwing himself into big projects, seeking the spotlight or the box office. Instead, he was devoting his time to a very private endeavor, a script. Not for fame, but for a dialogue with himself. The story is inspired by the two filmmakers, by their similarities, differences, and the silent rivalry that accompanied them for many years. Those who read the early drafts say that although Rob isn't directly mentioned, his presence is evident in every detail, every dialogue, as if Ron is continuing a conversation that was left unfinished. It's whispered that this might be the most emotionally charged work Ron has ever written. It's both a tribute, an acknowledgement, and a way to say goodbye. Ron has never confirmed whether the script will ever be released. When asked, he simply smiles and says it's a story about losing someone who truly understood him, even if they never fully understood each other. For the first time, Ron doesn't shy away from the tension that once existed between them. He transforms it into art, into a safe space to confront and accept it. And perhaps that's where the story concludes. Not with a complete explanation, but with a quiet truth. Two men who spent their lives telling the stories of the world while still searching for their own. Ron Howard and Rob Reiner, two names synonymous with a glorious era of Hollywood. One cautious, meticulous, building emotion with subtlety and empathy. The other bold, unafraid of confrontation, constantly pushing the world to think and confront. Two different paths, two contrasting styles. Yet both driven by a common fire. The desire to find meaning in the chaos of life. After Rob's passing, Ron no longer saw him as a colleague or former rival, but as a part of his own journey of growth. A loss that slowed him down, made him more reserved and gentler with the world around him. He realized that legacy doesn't lie in perfection or trophies. It lies in the connection, in the relationships that have left a profound mark. The stories of Ron, Rob, and Clint all remind us that behind the lights, fame, and applause are real people with love, regret, and extraordinary resilience. And perhaps that's what makes this story so touching. Because after every film, every career, and every friendship, a simple truth remains. Our time is limited, and what matters most is how we choose to live with it. So what do you think? Is the silent rivalry between them a barrier or a gift that helps both of them reach further? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story leaves you with something to ponder, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video so more people can see the very human side of Hollywood legends. Because some stories don't end when the credits roll.